Laurie, good to see you again.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, thank you. This is my second time on the island,
Right?
right?
Yes, we did this back in June.
We
for the
did.
book festival,
We did.
And it was a lot of fun. And I have to say, I was about to board a plane for Syracuse, where, of course, your incredible Speak is set. And I was reading Speak, because trying to, get up to speed. And it was just an incredible experience. You have this ability to imaginatively get into the heart and soul of someone that is very specific, but with whom you immediately connect.
Thank you.
That sense. And it also seemed, this came out in 1999.
99, almost 20 years ago.
Almost 20 years ago. And it just, what was like an electric shock was how immediate it is. I mean, it's as if it was ripped out of the headlines today.
Sadly.
And given your experience in the schools here on Nantucket
Right,
today,
right.
and all the books you've written since, I mean, where are kids going today? And, how does that, the universality you were able to get there and how it all works?
Well, Speak is my first novel. Oh, hang on, was he doing it? Oh. You missed all the really great things he just said. I'm sorry, you guys. It's a shame that wasn't recorded, because just pearls of wisdom coming out. Speak is my first novel. It was published in 1999. It's a YA contemporary book. And it's about a ninth grader struggling to find the courage to speak up. Before the book opens, she's a victim of a rape. She doesn't tell anybody. And so as she goes through her freshman year, she's coping with the depression, with the trauma. She's also coping with being a ninth grader, which is hard under the best of circumstances. When the book came out, obviously in 1999, there were some people who were not really pleased that I wrote it, because they were uncomfortable with the idea that a teenager might read this book. That hasn't stopped, which is very, very interesting. And I'm actually I was just talking to my editor, we're going to do a 20th anniversary edition of Speak. So we're trying to figure out how to prepare for that. And the graphic novel version of the book is coming out in February. So I've been thinking a lot about what has changed and what hasn't changed in the past almost 20 years. And on the one hand, we see California moving to consent-based sexual policies, so you have to get a yes from a potential partner instead of just maybe a no. And we're having conversations with kids about consent. We talked about that at the high school a lot today. And that consent has to be sober, which comes as a surprise to 16-year-olds. Sober, I always say as a mom, you should probably not have conversations with potential future sexual partners unless you actually have your clothes on. Preferably with a table between the two of you, less distracting that way. So it's easier to have those kinds of conversations than 20 years ago. We've seen in the past couple of weeks, thank goodness, there are some positive things to social media, the whole hashtag #MeToo, with victims of sexual violence around the world using social media in the wake of Harvey Weinstein finally getting dragged the way he should be, hopefully off to jail someday. But it's, we have women, first of all, not all victims of sexual violence are women. And the men and boys I've talked to who've had to deal with that trauma, they find it even harder, I think, sometimes than women to speak up and get the kind of support and love that they need and deserve. But we've been such a shame-based culture for so long here. I see us taking a couple steps forward and then we go sliding back, and then maybe a little bit. So we haven't come as far as I thought we would 20 years ago.
Yeah, so it's... Okay.
Yeah, all right.
Here I am.
Are you going to start singing now?
Yeah. Valare. Now, you've, that really sort of began things, but you'd been writing for quite a while before that.
I had been writing badly.
Really? Yeah. Would you look back and see that as the book where it all sort of came together for you?
Well, there were two things going on. I'd written picture books and I'd published those, but you can really get away with murder with only using 500 words. Like, people don't notice your narrative style so much, as long as everything's spelled right, and there's good pictures. But I'd written some very failed novels, my apprentice attempts that shall never see the light of day. But I've been working on Fever 1793, which was my first historical novel. I'd been working on that for about 4 years and had gotten to the point in the writing process where I was just stuck. Like, it was done, it had been submitted, it had been rejected, and I didn't know how to make it better. So I had been trying to figure out the form of the novel for quite a while. I put that aside and wrote Speak, just because the story came to me very clearly. The early draft of Fever was the third-person point of view, and Speak was a very strong first-person, unreliable narrator.
And how did that come to you?
In a nightmare. I had a
Did it?
bad, well, I mean, this is partly my story. I was sexually assaulted when I was 13 and didn't tell anybody for 25 years. And what was happening, looking back on hindsight's always 20/20, my oldest daughter had just gotten hit by the puberty stick. And like overnight went looking, she was a 12-year-old when she went to bed, and she looked like she was 22 at the breakfast table. And whenever your oldest child goes through that, man, that's a scary day. You're just like, oh, geez. And so that's probably what led
What
to.
kicked it in,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I realized I had to start dealing with my stuff. But so the writing of Speak and Fever in my head are always kind of tandem, because the books taught each other how to be told.
Right. So you then wrote Speak in a
Yep.
rush, pretty much?
Well, a year. I
Yeah.
don't think that's a rush.
Yeah.
But it was Speak was written 4 to 6 in the morning. Every day I'd get up. So I think what was exciting, because every once in a while, it doesn't happen with every book, I don't know about with you, but some books are just, got to go to work and you got to write the book, and it's a good idea and you're going to do a good job. But other books wake you up at 4 o'clock in the morning because you're hungry to get to them.
Right. So you when it's hitting you, you get up at 4 a.m.?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like a bolt.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's like, well, I need coffee at that point. But,
Yeah. And then write for 2 hours and then go on with your day? Or?
Well, back then I had a day job and I had kids.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then, and these days, if I'm home, because we travel way too much, but if I'm home and the kids now have all got houses of their own, so nobody interrupts me at 6. I can keep going.
Yeah.
That's fun.
And so then you returned to Fever.
Yeah.
And how did you see that differently after having written Speak?
It's hard to piece out how much of my insight into Fever came from taking a year away from it. Because when you're into a story up to your eyeballs, often you have at least I have so little perspective. I can't see how to make it better. And but when I went back to it and I realized that I really wanted to experiment with writing the first-person narrator in Fever as well, because I had just done that in Speak, I was like, oh, now we're cooking with gas.
Yeah.
And so it was really a fun thing to do.
Right.
The story came alive.
Yeah. So how do you deal with research in terms of the research, learning about what you want to write about, and then igniting that voice that you have? Because each one of your historical novels, that's the real continuity between your other ones, is that there is that voice, that specific person, and how does that inform your research and vice versa?
Oh, that's really interesting. You ask good questions.
Well, I'd like to hear the answer.
Have you ever thought about writing? I think it was much harder to find the voice or to wait patiently for the voice in the historical novels. I mean, I'm emotionally frozen at 15. There's a big part of me that never stopped being a teenager. So finding the voice for the YA novels is much less of a challenge. With the historical novels, and for 3 out of the 4 novels, I was writing outside my ethnic background, so that was another layer of research and had to understand representation issues and do a whole lot more work to make sure I was trying to write with integrity. And so for me, I guess, I roll, I've got a dog who loves to roll in turkey poop. Yep, a German Shepherd, she's old, and Lord, does she love turkey poop, man.
Only turkey?
Only turkey, right?
Okay,
We've had
well.
pheasants come through, and no, it's just, there's something, because it reeks, it's horrible. But she's so happy, she loves to smell like turkey poop. That's the way I am with research. I just like to roll around in it,
So the research is turkey poop.
It's fodder,
And then you try to come up smelling in a way
yes.
like the past. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. But I think that you know this, that submersion in the, not only the research that goes in the books, because that's very few of the details of the facts that we come across in primary sources and stuff ever make it into the story. But you have to kind of, live in that world of reading all of the newspapers that came out that month, in Philadelphia or New York, even though you're only going to pull a fact from a couple. Because understanding, like, what people were buying in the shops, and the guy who was selling ribbons very much cheaper now, his ribbons are more, it's like the gestalt of the world has to be absorbed, like turkey poop. And then at some point in the storytelling and the research and writing process, the only way I can describe it is magic.
Yeah.
That's when the voice comes.
Right, and the voice comes, and it feels magic in terms of you're channeling something?
Yeah, it takes my breath away.
Yeah.
When I start to hear it, and don't get me wrong, I wish that my characters would dictate entire novels, and that's never come close, but I always know that that's when it's time to start writing, is when, because like lines drop into your head, right? Maybe it's from the gods, the writing gods, they love us. And a line will drop into your head, and I hear it, and so that's how I
So you
feel
hear
it.
a voice?
Yeah.
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 And, well, your dialogue is so great, and so you're hearing...
Yeah.
Yeah, and so when that hits you you wake up at 4 and you hear that voice, you hit it?
I can tell you when I heard the voice for the first time in Chains, I was beginning to despair because I had been rolling around in the research for a couple of years, and I knew lots of facts, but I didn't have the true voice of the character. And I went to the New York Historical Society. This is when they had that great exhibit about slavery in New York. So a great book that came out of that too. And they had a sculpture in the front of this exhibit made of very, very thin silver wire. And it was a man and a woman who had bundles on the back. They had been held in slavery and they were escaping. That was sort of the story the sculpture was telling. But it was so cool because the artist was so smart. As you stood there and you leaned to the side, the wire was so thin, they disappeared. Yeah. And you came back this way, and then they were, and I realized, because in New York City in 1776, 20% of the people who lived there were held in slavery. 1 in 5, New York City. And they were so visible, but to the people who held power and had privilege, they chose to not see them. And then Isabel said to me, the best time to talk to ghosts is just before the sun comes up. And I was like, off we go.
That's a line, yeah.
Off we go.
Yeah, yeah. And I find I will research specifically the book and then a chapter, and it's all there, and I have this sort of sense of panic. How is it going to go together? I work up the notes, and then begin to find a way in, and then it's similar to what you're saying, that, wow, this is the way to go. And for me, it's that beginning, that just what you're saying. It's once you find a way in, it begins to fall into place.
Have you ever come across a detail in your research, and either when you find it or when you're going and you're trying to figure out which door you're going to walk in to tell that chapter, it's that detail gives you the key? Is there anything specific?
Oh, yeah.
Can you give us some examples?
Well, there's one. I'm working on a chapter now.
Tell me.
And sometimes there'll be a detail that is just so good, I find myself bending things around it to a point that it breaks.
Yeah.
And that really is upsetting to me when it's such a good detail, but it just won't work.
Yes.
And then there are the details where I find if I put the detail too front and center, it doesn't allow the plot to unfold in a natural way. And so I'm conflicted when it comes to the details. There's one, for example, I am writing about the year of Yorktown, and it's now the battle. The siege is about to start. And there's been a big naval battle already, and which was really fun to write. Oh, I mean, it was just great, cannons, splinters
awesome.
everywhere. But one of the things that made this all happen was that the Spanish provided a loan to the French. The French were not going to be able to sail up to Virginia unless they had this loan of millions of pesos. and it was in silver coins. And that's a lot of silver coins. And so the French commissary is in a house in Williamsburg trying to organize a hospital and all these things. And the barrels of pesos are right beside him when suddenly the floor collapses because of the weight of all the loan. I mean, and this is just such good, and and he falls in, and he doesn't know what's going on, and talk about the weight of anyways.
The weight of history,
right?
And
the weight of all this stuff, and it's those kinds of things. It's the surprising details I find that really. So anyway, so I'm trying to figure out, and may end up just being in my notes. I know you do a lot of good with your historical novels. You have a lot of back matter that really is help, and clearly you enjoy the research enough that you want to let people know the trail.
I should call the back matter the cutting room floor.
Yes, that's what I call my notes.
Exactly, because it's that material. Well, for me, I think it's very important. Because I know that the kids reading my book are probably going to remember that book better than they remember their textbooks, which is why it's super important to have the books read by historians and make sure that the facts that I'm conveying are accurate, or as accurate as you can ever be with history. And then in the back of the books, I try to really be very clear with the readers what is factual, what truly happened, what was the stuff that I made up. And then you get to put in cool little details like the fact that in 1781, which prince was it? Was it the third one, Prince William?
Yep.
Prince William, King George's the son, number 3, came to New York City at the end of the American Revolution. He went ice skating. And there's this plot to kind of try to kidnap him.
Right, to capture him.
Yeah, it's like, golly, how can you not talk about this? So yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
Those
gems.
So. With your historical novels, you've done the trilogy of the Revolution, and you just were saying you were on a tour for the paperback of the final one.
Yep.
And what's next? What are you thinking about?
I'm actually going to be doing some research. I promised to write a book that looks at George Washington through the lens of the people that he held in slavery. Because we have to find a way in this country to talk about the wonderful things that our heroes did, and the Founding Fathers did a lot of fine things, but they didn't do everything great. And because of the choices that were made all along our historical path, we are still living in a country with radical racial injustice. I have friends who don't look like me, who are treated differently, their children are treated differently. Our fathers came back from World War II. My dad got a GI loan. Their dad couldn't. My family didn't get redlined. And these inequities that I think one thing that social media helps us with is that we are learning about each other in ways that many places, if you're living in an isolated area like where I used to live up north, that's a challenge. So I know, and people, how the choices that George Washington, for example, made affected popular culture and affect people's thoughts. So I'm struggling with the way to tell this story that will honor all of the people who lived at Mount Vernon and all of their labors, and tell the story in a way that's accurate and fair and maybe eye-opening. So that's the big challenge for me right now.
Right, because I am at this point struggling with how to represent Washington's relationship with slavery, and it is a very complicated story.
Have you talked to Mary Thomas at Mount Vernon?
No.
Thompson? I'll give her your.
Yeah.
She knows more about the enslaved families at Mount Vernon and Washington's relationship.
Mm-hmm.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
Good resource.
But he thought about not necessarily freeing his slaves. Upon his death, he did.
Yeah.
But there was talk between John Laurens and Hamilton.
Yep.
If you've seen the musical, about a scheme by which the South was getting ravaged in the Revolution, and they had this large slave population and not enough soldiers.
Right.
The plan was, let's give the slaves freedom.
Right.
And win the war.
Right.
And it was John Laurens, with Hamilton's help, that really came up with the idea at Valley Forge.
Yep.
And Washington initially, talk about Washington's relationship
Well, and
with
it's
it.
important to point out that John Lawrence's father was Henry Lawrence.
One of the biggest slaveholders,
One
if
of
not the biggest.
The biggest slaveholder, I think,
Yeah.
in the country. He
Yeah.
was a trader in Charleston, South Carolina, president of the Second Continental Congress, I think, and later captured. And John wrote to his father and said, "Dad, this is what I want to do." And his dad wrote back and went, "Yeah, no, you really don't want to do that." Not very supportive of it. And, you know, and Washington, I think that wonderful group of young men, you know, his family. Washington used to call those young men his family because I think he did look upon them as a father or an uncle. I think they you know, I don't know that I can find evidence in his writings. We know that Lafayette was also a part of this. Lafayette was kind of, he said later in life that he wasn't sure that he would have, I'll get the quote wrong, wasn't sure he would have fought this war if he didn't know that it wouldn't free everybody. He was appalled by slavery. And Lafayette and Washington explored if they could maybe buy land in the Ohio River Valley, and because Washington was concerned if he just freed people, they'd be victimized. And he had a responsibility to help them transition into life. I think that listening to those men, to Lawrence and Lafayette and Hamilton, you know, you can just see them, right, late at night, you know, having a glass of wine and tossing around these ideas, which must have sounded so radical to Washington's ears. Washington, remember, in September of 1775, I think that was the date when he ordered all the men of color out of the Continental Army. And then the British said, "Oh, if you are an enslaved person and you join us, we'll free you."
Yeah.
And weeks later, Washington goes, "All right, you can come back." Right? So he was reluctant. There was no heroism. It was a reluctant back and forth. I think one of the things that horrified me most about Yorktown, post-Yorktown, was Washington demanding that the British return the slaves that had run to them.
Yeah.
And held them in a garrison. And there's this jerk from Virginia who was appointed, his name was David something, who was appointed to put ads in all the newspapers to notify. And so these people who had run for freedom and who had fought for freedom were handed back.
Right, and it's just terrible as the siege is occurring and they're, you know, knocking on Cornwallis's door. You know, he's running out of food, so he lets the slaves that he's invited here have freedom, help me build my fortification. So they've been working day and night for weeks. And many of them contract smallpox.
Right.
And so Cornwallis sees this as a way to infect the opposition and get rid of mouths to feed.
Yeah.
So he lets thousands of them go, and they don't know where to go. They get caught between the lines, and thousands of them die.
Yeah. Horrific.
You know, it's horrific, and I think, but it's so important for people to realize that the battle that won the right to have the Declaration of Independence is, you know, that instills that ideal, was fought in terms that were nowhere near what we see as the ideals this country should
Correct.
live up to. And it's a tough story to write about truthfully, and not lose, you can't get completely cynical about it, I think. Washington and Jefferson, Jefferson, his relationship with slavery was even more onerous.
It was, yeah,
but
absolutely.
both of them realized that if they didn't deal with it, they were, Jefferson says, we have the wolf by the ear, and we don't dare let him go.
Right.
And because they knew it was going to tear the country apart at some point.
And it continues to.
And it continues to.
It continues to. I think when I'm talking to children, I'm always looking for a way to give them hope, give them something to build on. And so I like to talk about, because by the time you get to to Yorktown, I forget if it's 20 or 25% of the Continental Army is men of color. And this was an integrated fighting force. This is the last time our army was integrated until the Korean War. You did have the Rhode Island Battalion that was a mixture of mostly men of color and Native American men. But within all the other regiments, you had, these were the Band of Brothers. And it's interesting, on my website, I've started a new page called heroes, not hate, because we're having a rash of empty pedestals in America. And I have a list of a number of fellows and some women who deserve statues and deserve to have schools named after them. And it's really interesting to follow the careers of some of these African-American veterans after the war. Because they go back to their communities, many of them, and become really significant guys. James Fortin and Paul Coffey in Rhode Island. And they're businessmen, they are leaders, they are veterans, they sacrifice for their country. And in New England, what we see is some of those friendships and relationships that the soldiers had. That's what I think. This is my theory, is that that's what helps change the hearts and minds in the Northlands. And Massachusetts obviously leading the way and outlawing slavery state by state. So we did do it. One of the worst things that happened after the American Revolution was the invention of the cotton gin. In Virginia, after the Revolution, you actually have a softening of a lot of rules. Manumission becomes legal in Virginia in the 1780s. It's wonderful correspondence with Washington and some of his neighbors in Virginia. He had a neighbor, Robert Pleasance, who actually freed everybody. Yeah. And then his relatives sued each other for a long time after that. And so like there's this moment, this half a heartbeat where you think, when you're reading the history, you're like, oh, they could have done it. And then the cotton gin gets invented.
Right, and that changes everything in terms of states, and slavery becomes such an important part to their identity, and
because of greed.
Because of greed.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about the past, and the thing about the present.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
It's human nature, and I think the worst thing you can do is look in the past and say, no, it was a different time. They were better than us. They saw where they were going. Baloney. They were just like us in terms of not knowing where they were going, being motivated by a wide range of things, with some of it altruistic, some of them completely self-centered. This is life.
Yeah,
And,
that's a very good point.
Yeah. So let's talk about your day today in the Nantucket schools.
Oh, yeah. You guys have great kids.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you do a lot of this.
I do.
And
apparently,
you compared yourself to Mary Poppins?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
How does that work?
Because my job is easy. What's hard is being a teacher and having to show up for work every single day. That's just kind of mind-boggling to me, right?
Yeah.
Whew. And parent meetings. Ooh, committee meetings.
Faculty meetings.
Oh, goodness. So that's pretty impressive that you guys can do that. But so I'm Mary Poppins. Many children's authors do this. You talk to mostly grown-ups, don't you?
Yeah.
Oh.
Very grown-up.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's more fun to talk to kids because, they don't mess around. They tell you what they think.
Yeah.
So I spoke today to the middle school kids, and then I spoke to the elementary children, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades, and that was in the morning. In the afternoon, I spoke to the entire high school. And different audience, that they had read different books. If the teachers are in the room, thank you very much. They were so exquisitely prepared. It was really, that makes it super easy when you don't have to explain everything to them. And they were lovely. They were respectful. They laughed. They were polite and kind. And it was really interesting and wonderful to talk to them.
Yeah. Well, good. And so how do you, I'm just curious, as a fellow author, you go to have a day like today, which is completely, you're out, you're on, and you're involved. And then you go home. Do you decompress? How do you immediately fall into your writing rhythm?
Well, there's not a lot of writing gets done between September and November, because that's when we're out. Like I was in Pittsburgh.
So that's the promotion.
There's actually 2 seasons. There's September through November, and then February through May. And it's not just because I don't know how grown-up authors do it, but for children's authors, it's hard to make a living off of royalties. So going out and doing school visits or speaking at conferences. I love to speak at conferences because then you get to talk to teachers and stuff. And then so the off season, if you will, is for writing. But also I'm trying to get a little bit better on some days. For example, this weekend I'll be doing some research in Boston and I'll be doing a lot of writing. At the end of a day like this where the energy output is so extreme, I'm not going to get any good writing done, but I can read at night. you know. And so everybody's got their kind of their tricks. But it's, for me, it is so gratifying to hang out with readers, you know, and that's, I think, a really important part of my job.
Well, yeah, and what I find is my books take so long.
Yeah.
And it's just me and the dog all day. And then just go on a book tour for,
Yeah.
6 weeks.
Oh.
And it's a different city every day, and it's great. It's so much, I actually enjoy it. But it's schizophrenic
It is.
in a really, and what I find is travel is a great opportunity for me to do research, because I find, it's sometimes hard to spend a day reading primary, stuff like that.
yeah.
But if I'm traveling, okay, it's a couple hours on a plane
Right.
here, an hour
Yeah.
here, and
Yeah.
and I find it's almost more efficient
Interesting.
to do that. Then it's helpful. But yeah, no, it's all tricks of the trade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are not complaining. We are
No.
really, we know
No.
how lucky we are.
Yeah. So describe your office and your writing desk. Well, how do you have things that are essential? And what are you doing in those 2 hours? Are you just like in the zone? Are you getting up and doing
Oh, that's
push-ups?
interesting.
What's
So I used to, when we lived up in north of Syracuse, because the advice I give anybody who wants to be a writer is you should marry a carpenter. Because my carpenter husband built me a writing cabin when we lived up north, and it was really sweet. It was really nice. But we decided...
You couldn't bring that to Philadelphia.
he offered to build me another one. But we bought a rambling old house that has a full third floor. So one end of the third floor is kind of the business office. That's where I do all the boring email stuff and pay taxes and horrible things like that. And then the other end of the attic is all of my books, and that's where the writing takes place. Because for me, physical space is kind of important. So the best thing is when I get to go up the stairs and take a right and go to the writing space instead of taking a left.
So do you completely divide your email life from your creative writing life?
Completely.
Yes.
Completely. Because it's a
So you
different
don't
part
feel
of my
the itch.
brain.
You don't feel
Oh,
the
God,
itch?
no.
No?
Oh,
Good.
I
Good for
hate
you.
email.
Yeah.
Anybody who's tried to write to me knows that. Because it's to me, I try to describe this as the difference between the writer part of our job and the author part of the job. This is the author part.
Yeah.
Corresponding with readers is the author part. For me, even like corresponding with the historians who vet my books, that's also kind of the author part. To me, that's quite different from like when you're writing and you're just so deep into it, you lose track of where you are.
Isn't that a great feeling?
That's my
Yeah.
favorite.
Yeah, that really is it. Yeah, it could be
Flow.
a beautiful day out
Yeah.
there, but if you reach that moment where
Yeah.
time doesn't exist,
Yeah.
and
Yep. And when you finally look at the window, you're like, oh my gosh, it's exquisite. I think that's the closest people our age can get to being a 3-year-old again.
yeah, totally. It's almost the definition of losing yourself, isn't it?
It truly is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you don't always feel it, and
No.
no.
And that's sad. Well,
Yeah.
so how does it work for you?
For in terms of how I organize
Yeah,
my
how you
life.
organize the
Well, I don't.
space
Everything is one place.
Yeah.
And it's down in the basement. I'm very envious that you go up.
Yeah.
I go down. And but no, I can't complain about the office. But and it's full of books, just because there's just so much stuff I have to read for each book, and and I'll typically begin the day sitting down, answering some emails, which is a mistake, I know. But I don't know, it sort of gets, because, Steinbeck used to begin by writing letters in the
Did
day.
he really?
To kickstart the process. And
Interesting.
I don't know, I find that okay.
Okay.
And the problem is, though, that just then creates a correspondence that
Yeah.
can then, but what I find is that 75% of my time is research,
Yeah.
note-taking, and then organizing the notes to the point where when I'm actually writing, that the part of the chapter I'm writing the notes are in my head
Right.
rather than something I'm thumbing through.
Right.
And it just requires a lot of intense sort of mind meld
Yes.
with the material. And that only comes after a lot of not only reading, researching, and note-taking, but internalizing it.
Yeah.
And then what I love the writing process, but for me, it's 25% of my time rather
Yeah,
than 75.
interesting.
And so and so that happens fairly quickly, at least for a first draft. And I do a lot of revising. I mean, it's and in fact, sometimes, when I'm writing something, I'm just wincing at how,
Oh, yeah. Well,
bad
yeah, that's
that-
okay, though.
Right,
Yeah,
it is good.
yeah.
And I love the revision process.
Yep.
And so for me, that's something. And so I will work till lunch, walk the dog, get lunch, work till the dog needs her big walk.
Yep.
Do that, and that's an hour where I'm walking,
Yep.
and I find that's where my best thinking is. That's where
Yeah.
everything I've been working on, I just sort of working through, and I don't want to walk with anyone. I just
Yep.
want to just sort of think about it, and then come back and work until Melissa, my wife, comes home, and which can be between 6 and 7 or later sometimes. And so that, for me, it's breaking up the day, because I find when I come back to the desk, you just have a new perspective.
Do you have the experience that you're tussling with how to put this fact into something, or the organization of a chapter, and you're like, whoa, you got your teeth into it, and just it's not working, and as soon as you walk out the door, it's right there. As soon as you start moving,
Yeah,
it comes to
yeah.
you.
No, movement is important. A dog gets you, because
Yeah.
my problem is I'll just sit there the whole day,
Right.
and then you get stale. And I
Yep.
think it's a process of sort of mixing it up
Yeah.
and seeing it afresh.
Yeah, nice.
And what is your, you write revision process? How does that work?
My first drafts are a hot mess. That's what I told the kids today. They are messy, and I wouldn't even there's not a lot of narrative structure in them. There's chunks of dialogue, because dialogue comes pretty easily to me. So if I'm hearing the characters, I was so relieved years ago when I was reading Stephen King's book on writing, and he talked about how, he'll see one scene, and then he'll see another scene a little bit later, but he doesn't know what joins them together. So he types XXX, put something here. And then he just jumps, like, oh, I can do that. That's awesome. So a first draft has a lot of that. I can see the
Because you don't want to
markers.
lose that vision of something down the
exactly,
line. Yeah,
exactly.
get it on paper.
Yep. And it often takes me writing the entire first draft to really understand the emotional arcs of the characters. Because I start with my YA stuff, I'm starting with something about the lives of contemporary teenagers that's challenging and really hard for a lot of kids. And I tend to be very angry about these things, because boy, do our kids put up with a lot. And so I do a lot of reading, and then I'll start to hear the voice. But I'm really often floundering in terms of not really having a plot, but there's many feelings and lots of dialogue.
So do you find yourself inventing characters, or?
Oh, yes, I go along.
As you go along,
Oh,
just to
yeah.
sort of fill in the how do I get from.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'll get to the end of the book, and usually what happens, because my subconscious is my smarter part, is the subconscious will toss up some image systems.
Yeah, King calls them the boys in the basement.
Although I like that.
Yeah.
And I see them as like messages in a bottle from a foreign shore. And there's image in Speak, one of the great image systems is the tree, also closets and mirrors. And that comes out without me thinking about it in an early draft. And then as I, kind of look at the cool edit, you write in heat and you revise with coolness. And I'm like, oh, I can see how I can expand this and kind of weave it into the fabric of the story, hopefully to create something that has a little bit of literary depth. With the historicals, it's a little bit different, because I have the plot. It's what happened in history. And I have to figure out how I make the characters interact with historical events.
Yeah, but you have to pick what parts you're gonna.
That was hard.
Yeah,
Oh,
because
man.
you know what's going to happen, but there's so many different ways to tell.
And
that.
I wrote these great chapters about the Battle of Oriskany,
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my. Oh, they're on the cutting room floor. I might have to like do a little small
Right, I
chat
was going to
book of
say
those.
that, yeah, and that
Oh.
was your hometown, basically.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. It's really dreadfully small battle. They didn't think it was
It was
small.
it was,
Yeah,
it was horrible.
yeah. Herkimer got his leg shot off. It was awesome.
Okay, so how do you, do you physically, do you print out a chapter and then scribble on it, or do you revise on the computer, or a mixture?
I have a hard time revising on the computer. I don't know if it's a generational thing. When something's on the screen, it looks nice. So I apologize, I should be planting trees. I tend to print things out. My secret writing tip, though, is that towards the end of the writing process, when I think I've made it as good as I can make it, but I'm sure that I've missed something, I will actually record myself reading the entire book. Did we talk about this last time?
No, I
No,
don't
we
think
didn't. So I will record the entire book, make my own audio book, and then I don't look at it for like a month. And then I'll sit down with a printout of it and my nice earphones, and I'll listen to myself reading the story out loud. So it's the first time I've heard the story read, really, from page 1 till the end. And my ears will catch mistakes that my eyes don't see anymore. And having the printout in front of me allows me just to do it page by page. And that process can take days.
Yeah, my equivalent of that is when I finish a first draft of a chapter, I read it to my wife Melissa after dinner, and so she's doing the dishes with a notepad beside the sink, and it's for me it's hearing it is so much. It's just entirely different. Once again, it's like a reboot or whatever, and then she'll write something down, and I'll say, what was wrong with that? Just keep going. But for me, that's she'll have input, but as I'm reading, marking,
Can't believe I used that word again.
Right.
5th time in 2 sentences.
And that's where the computer is helpful now, where you can, find, the one word that you keep using. And,
over and over.
Yeah, over and over.
Can I ask you a question, though? So you're really writing and revising chapter by chapter?
Yes. Oh, yeah, yeah. No, each chapter for me is its own entity.
That's fascinating.
I work chapter by chapter. I finally get it to the point where I'll read it to Melissa, revise it, and then send it to my father and my researcher, who then give me their input. My father, the ex-English professor, is particularly nitpicker.
Oh.
But it's great because it's almost just the process of sharing it for me, and it gives just me a sense of, okay, how's it going? At least I'm sharing it with 3 others,
right?
And it's helpful for me because I just to go the whole distance without any input would be just almost emotionally hard. So I then get it to a point where, and I also do my notes at that time.
Smart.
Because if you save your notes to the end, it's misery, because when you've finished a chapter, where everything, it's all, but it's terrible because I just want to get going on the next one. It's the last thing you want to do, but it's 2 days of my life, and once it's down there, it's good. So, so I'm working chapter by chapter.
Do you use, I'm thinking about turning one of the walls of my office into a whiteboard, just because I have some projects coming up that are kind of complex, and I've experimented with a lot of different kind of visual organization techniques, and I'm thinking that a wall-sized whiteboard might be the way to do it, to lay out, all that. How do you manage all this stuff?
Yeah, well, visually I have a lot of maps on the walls, and for me, just going to the place, I just, that visual aspect, once again, you don't quite know how it gets into the book, but it helps. And I make outlines for each chapter, each part of a chapter, and they could be on a whiteboard. They're on, pieces of paper, but, and then I have, for each book, I'll get, I have a bust of Washington now on, stuff like that is helpful. But the hardest thing for me is just, given the volume of books I have, is then remembering where they all are. And, so I'll roughly organize them like a library but then, I know I have it, but damn it, where the heck is
Yep,
it?
yep.
And the worst thing I can do is try to clean up my office, because then
No.
I lose the trail
No,
of
never.
where it is, yeah.
That's a bad thing. And then it's so depressing when you've like filled all the bookcases in your house. And you have to bring another bookcase in, hopefully when your spouse isn't observing this happening. And then you have to kind of reorganize things though, and it's painful.
Well, we had a storage locker, that was full of books from prior
Yeah,
projects,
sure.
and it just was getting ridiculous. And I didn't even know what was in there, and I would buy a book, rebuy a book, realizing I had it. This is stupid.
Yep.
So I then asked the Athenaeum if they were interested for their book sale, but it's the book sales really here don't work because people don't come to buy books.
Right.
And where Melissa grew up in Falmouth, they have a very big book sale every summer where dealers from all over the country come, and so every 3 years, take carton loads of books, put them in our truck, take them on the ferry, and go to Falmouth, and they donate it to them, and they make some money. But otherwise, I don't know where I'd put these things.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and it's hard though. You just don't. And I scribble. One of the pieces of advice David McCullough gave to me years ago. He said, just buy the books.
Yep.
Just buy the books, write on them, scribble on them, whatever, and it's the right thing.
It
Because I
is.
don't know, do you scribble on your
yeah.
books?
I think a book it's not alive until I started to mark it up. When people, it's like, okay, somebody's a friend, like when they sleep over at your house and then you see them in the morning, they see you and you're in your pajamas and your hair is like that, and it's like, that's when you know you're friends, right? That you know that you're friends with a book when you start scribbling in it, and you drop your coffee on it, and there's crumbs from a donut, and yeah.
Yeah, do you get heated in your discussion, what you write in a book?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, I once found the books I wrote in college, and I just didn't remember. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's exactly what I'm doing now. I
Yeah.
just had, big exclamation marks,
Yes.
wrong,
Yes.
that kind of stuff.
I
So
can't believe you're still saying
Right.
that. Yeah, yeah.
Well, listen, this has been great. Well, should we turn it over to see if
Yeah,
anybody else
that'd be
has any
super good,
questions?
yeah.
Please.
Heaps on
Come
you
on,
guys.
anybody out there?
Oh,
Oh,
light.
lights are up. Yes.
I'm kind of curious to know what your students who you spoke to today,
Yeah.
Patrick asked you, what their concerns were for their
Well, it depends on the age we talk about. So the elementary school kids, depending on the grade, read one of two of my nonfiction picture books. I've got one called Independent Dames, about 88 girls and women who played important roles during the Revolution. Another book called Thank You, Sarah, which is how Sarah Josepha Hale from New Hampshire kind of led the way to creating the national holiday that is Thanksgiving. So they wanted to know, like, well, how did you get interested in it, and what were the facts, and this and that. Fever 1793 is what the fifth graders read. That's an epidemic that hit Philadelphia. George Washington was president, Alexander Hamilton, secretary of the treasurer. So America was this baby country, and this epidemic was terrible. And the kids, they want to know. Some of them want to know about the science in that book. I think for those younger kids, understanding the historical context is a challenge. I tried to help them a little bit today in terms of this is when the Revolution happened, this is when the Civil War happened, and then these are the things in the middle. And you could see them just going, is it true that they bled out of their eyeballs? Their thoughts were in a different place. With the high school, though, it was interesting because we talked about Speak. All of the ninth graders in the classroom from the beginning of the year read Speak. They just finished it. And it was on summer reading for the rest of the school. Speak is commonly taught across America in 8th or 9th grade is the grades where it's most commonly taught. And it opens up fantastic conversations about sexual violence, the concept of consent, the idea that you have to have somebody's permission before you touch their body. I've spoken over the years to tens of thousands of survivors of sexual violence. And that's not a conversation you ever want to have to hear from your own children. So I was really impressed with the way that the kids wanted to talk about these things. And they wanted to, they lots of, there was obviously a little bit of squirming going on in the audience, but their questions for the most part were really thoughtful and intelligent. So quite different audiences, quite different books, but a lot of heart involved from all the kids.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier that some of your works have been censored.
Oh, yeah.
You want to speak to that?
Sure, yeah. My dad used to tell me that I should write thank you notes to people when they censor my books because it increases book sales. There was a fellow, my favorite book censor has a Dickensian name. He's Wesley Scroggins. And I kid you not, he lives in He lives in Liberty, Missouri. And he went before the school board and demanded that they revise their health curriculum. They take out my book and Kurt Vonnegut's book and all other things that he disagreed with. This man's homeschooling his children, for the record. But he called speak pornography. And that just got me all kinds of fired up. So the nice thing about Liberty, Missouri is that they let me write an op-ed. And so I got to say things like, any grown man who considers the rape of a 13-year-old pornographic has larger issues than what the kids in his community are reading for school. But what I've found over the years, because he's kind of the exception to the rule. Obviously he has a lot of political motivation and maybe some stuff in his life to work on. But usually what I see when my books are censored are parents who I have a lot of love and respect for. They're parents who, like me, was terrified when my kids got to 9th grade and they realized how big the culture was and how scary and how high the stakes were. And as a parent, you can't control, internet porn or all this other horrifying stuff, but you feel like you have the ability to go to a school board meeting and say, I want that book taken off the shelves. And so I've learned over the years to respect and honor parental love. And there's a way to do that while still disagreeing to my dying breath with them, because we have the First Amendment to the Constitution. We have a Supreme Court case in 1982, Pico versus Island Trees Schools, that backs us up, that says government cannot remove things like that. Parents can choose for their own children, that's their responsibility. But another parent can't choose for my child. And another parent shouldn't be able to influence the decisions of the educated teaching staff and administration staff of a school who are supposed to be the experts in these things. So it just is continuing to go on. A school district in the Panhandle of Florida, Dixie County Schools in the Panhandle of Florida, just issued a directive saying that there will no longer be books that allow profanity or anything that's considered inappropriate. And wait till the ACLU is about to come knocking. And it's just, we have a lot of educating to do in this country about so many things.
So I live in Washington, and I'd say some of us are deeply concerned, as are Americans across this country, about our state of democracy. Both of you are writers who've done deep dives into history. Of course, as they say, we do repeat it. What is a perspective from both of you who've gone really deep and into the past, and then yet are visionary looking to the future? Do you have any kind of sense of where we are as a country and what we should be doing as we are moving forward?
Go ahead. No, I've been blathering. It's your turn.
Well, this is a terrible time, but it was a terrible time at the time of the Revolution. The Continental Congress was completely dysfunctional. Leaders had completely lost their way. We only won because the French helped us.
And the Spanish.
And the Spanish. And, it really wasn't working. People didn't look around and say, oh, we're going for independence and liberty. It was a mess. It should have just fallen apart. And for reasons that we're still trying to figure out,
Right.
It didn't. And, yes, we have a challenging situation now. I tend to be a total pessimist, but the one thing I have some optimism about is the strength of our institutions. And we've been around now a long time. That there's never been a time where it seemed like we had it figured out and we're on the right track. We just go through times where it's worse. It seems worse, and it's bad. We've never had had this specific situation. But, you know, I think the important thing is for people to be involved. The way I always thought, you know, this country's been born in a revolution. Every generation has its own revolution. Then the stakes will always be high, and they will be for everything. And it will not come through completely in the right way. This is a democracy. Things have to get really bad before they get better. It's always been that way. We've never sort of said, oh, we should do this. No, first thing that happens is it gets so bad that people realize, oh, we begrudgingly have to do this. It's never, let's plan a little and figure it out. And it's bad now, but it's been bad in the past. And, you know, people say, you know, no, look at the past. Those who don't know their past are doomed to repeat it. I'm afraid no matter how well you know your past, you're doomed to repeat it. The only thing it can teach you is humility, because when you're in the middle of living, nothing's apparent. There's no obvious path. And we're all just making it up as it goes along. And just you hope that the bad stuff will make it so obvious that things need to move in a more, you know, in a different direction. What's your?
What I would add to that is that one of the things that makes me really afraid is that, you know, as in education, you've got pendulums that swing back and forth, and I've heard across the country from so many school districts that in the push to improve student scores on these tests, they've taken hours every week away from the teaching of history, civics, government, social studies. So our kids coming through public education today for the last 15 years don't understand it as well as they should, which is part of why they're not. So I would really love to see us be more concerted effort to teach these things and to teach them well. And we've got so many immigrants too that need to learn it. It's not like, you know, it's not fair of us to expect their parents to, you know, like bone up on it. And our parents certainly don't. People who've been here for generations, we have a responsibility, I think, to make sure that everybody who comes to America can understand some of these basic facts about the way our system works. The other thing that scares the dickens out of me is the manipulation of voting rights. That's immoral, that's heinous. And I think that's something that I'll mount the barricades for.
Yes.
You both seem to really love so much what you do. It's beautiful to see the passion. I'm wondering, since it also seems like you're almost buried alive happily in your work, what's your guilty pleasure? What do you do for fun? I know you have a dog, so I'm thinking that's kind of...
What do you do for fun?
I play with my grandson.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually really awesome. But this is fun. I mean, like, my kids sometimes don't understand that, and they're like, "Mommy, you know, stop working." But it's fun. I mean.
Yeah. No, but it can be tough for the people around us.
It can. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good observation. That's a very gentle way of saying that.
Being self-absorbed is
Yes,
terrific.
that's another way to say it. Yeah.
Well, it's now 5 minutes past the hour, so Laurie, thank you so much.
Oh, buddy, this was so delightful again. Thank you. Thank you.